In 1887, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz proved the existence of electromagnetic waves, and it's upon his shoulders that our entire modern world of wireless communications has been built. But yet there was one German physicist who described what Hertz discovered as being of no use whatsoever. Who would so foolishly lack the foresight to see the long-reaching, revolutionary implications of Hertz's work? Well, it was Hertz himself, and sadly he would die 7 years after his greatest scientific achievement at the age of 36, and miss out on seeing the radio age begin just a few short years later at the hands of Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi. In 1909, Marconi would be awarded the Nobel Prize for his work in wireless telegraphy. Hertz would have been 51 years old had he lived. So just how did Hertz prove the existence of electromagnetic waves? And how did this pave the way for radio and the work of Marconi? Well, that's what this episode is all about. Last episode, we broke down some of the science of how electromagnetic waves are created. So now let's get into Hertz's successful experiment and the process he created. Hertz used a setup called a spark gap transmitter to successfully generate his electromagnetic wave. So let's walk through how this worked by building it up step by step. First, we'll start with something called an oscillating circuit. When a charged capacitor is placed in a circuit with an induction coil, it creates a circuit where the current essentially bounces from one side of the capacitor through the circuit to the other. When the charged capacitor is placed in the circuit, it begins to empty its charge, creating a flow of current through to the inductor. As the inductor receives the current, it begins to create a magnetic field that increases as the current increases. Now, at some point, the capacitor is going to hit the max amount of current it can output, and from that point, the current is going to decrease. What happens as the current decreases is the magnetic field created by the inductor begins to collapse, and as it does, the inductor switches polarities, which then sends the current through to charge the opposite side of the capacitor, causing it to now switch polarities. Once the capacitor is fully charged, it then releases its charge back to the inductor, with the exact same process happening again, this time in reverse. Why is this important? Well, if we chart the rise and fall of current on a graph, it creates a wave of a specific frequency determined by the time these oscillations take, which also means we can create a wave of a specific frequency by adjusting the elements of this circuit to either reduce or increase the time taken for a complete cycle. This process of back and forward continues until the circuit runs out of charge, because of resistance within the various elements. But if we place a battery into that circuit, we are able to create a continuous wave, so this is what Hertz did, along with including a switch. So from what we know, we're already creating an electromagnetic wave. But at this voltage, this would be a very small wave, like throwing a tiny pebble into a pond. Very hard to pick up with the receiver as rudimentary as what they were working with. So Hertz added in another piece, the spark gap. Each end of the gap would build up an opposing charge until there was enough voltage to cause the current to leap across the gap in a burst of spark. And when this happened, the electromagnetic wave created would have enough energy to be able to travel the distance to the receiver, and with enough energy remaining to be detected. The receiver was built from a loop antenna with its own spark gap. And when the wave hits the antenna, the electrons within the antenna move in a burst that creates a second, smaller spark on the receiver. And just like that, Hertz had created proof of electromagnetic waves, and also established a process that allowed them to be controlled and reproduced. The oscillating circuit of the capacitor and inductor would set the frequency of the wave, and the switch would control switching the wave on or off. Genius. From there, things accelerated quickly. In 1890, the French physicist and engineer Edouard Branly invented what he called the radio conductor, a much more sensitive device for detecting radio waves than Hertz's loop antenna receiver with its spark gap. Branly discovered that when loose metal filings receive an electromagnetic wave, they move from having very high resistance to electric current to low resistance, which means you could establish a circuit that contained these metal filings and they would allow no current to flow until it received a radio wave, which would then shift the filings to low resistance, allowing a current to flow, and the current would indicate the presence of radio waves. In 1894, British physicist Sir Oliver Lodge delivered a memorial lecture on the work of Hertz, who had recently died, and displayed various demonstrations of his work. He would also develop an improved version of Brunel's radio conductor that he called the cohera. And much like Hertz, he believed the ability to transmit radio waves held no practical use, even with his own experiments increasing the distance of transmission to 55 meters. It was this renewed publicity of Hertz's work that caught the attention of a young Italian named Guglielmo Marconi, who began to pursue how these ideas could be applied to wireless telegraphy. Up until this time, many had tried to crack the idea of wireless telegraphy, but none had yet come up with an idea that could be both technically and commercially successful. Even the famous Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and Nikola Tesla had tried and failed, Tesla quite spectacularly with his Wardenclyffe Tower project. Unbeknownst to them, young Marconi quietly got to work in the attic of his home in Italy. In 1894, he developed a storm alarm using a battery connected to a cohera and an electric bell. When the cohera would detect the electromagnetic waves generated by the lightning, the bell would ring. His parents encouraged his pursuits, and by the following year, with his own improvements to the design of each component, he was transmitting signals a distance of up to 3.2 kilometers and over hills. He had just created the world's first functioning and commercially viable radio transmission system, and nobody knew about it. And at least in the case of Italy, his home, no one seemed to care. He was encouraged to travel to Great Britain, where it was believed he would find greater interest in his work, and then subsequent funding. So at the age of 21, with his mother accompanying him, he travelled to London in early 1896. Within months, he was demonstrating his apparatus for the British government, then delivering public lectures, and by 1897 he had successfully transmitted Morse code, a distance of 16 kilometres. International attention soon followed, even from his now suddenly interested home nation of Italy, and within 5 years he had transmitted a distance of 3,400 kilometres. Later that same year, in December 1902, he sent the world's first transatlantic radio message. The age of global wireless communication had truly begun, and we were no longer bound by cables to be able to reach each other. While Marconi was expanding the limits of transmission distance for the wireless telegraph, the Canadian inventor Reginald Fessenden was in the US building on the same concepts to send the world's first audio transmission. And on December 23, 1900, using a high-frequency spark transmitter, the very same technique that Hertz had demonstrated in basic form, he successfully transmitted speech a distance of 1.6 kilometers, and the gates were truly open for a whole new world of communication. From there, many advancements were made until we were broadcasting music, entertainment, and news all over the world. Combined with the telephone, the world had suddenly leapt into a level of connection humanity had never experienced before. Words on a page were one thing, but to hear the human voice, to listen to your king's actual voice in your own home, was incredible. The world was suddenly brought into our homes. An article in the May 7, 1899 issue of the New York Times headlined "Future of Wireless Telegraphy" sums it up well. All the nations of the earth would be put upon terms of intimacy, and men would be stunned by the tremendous volume of news and information that would ceaselessly pour in upon them. And it was perhaps in anticipation of this future that Marconi would later in life wonder, have I done the world good, or have I added a menace? And as we know, whether it was a menace or not, things did not stop there. We could now communicate across the world almost instantly, speaking to people on the other side of the planet. We could listen to events as they happened live. We could experience performances, stories, music, and information, and hear reports of happenings all over the world. But what if we could see them too? Was there some way we could use these same waves to send images along with audio? And that's where we're headed next episode, as we continue this massive journey of uncovering the process of how we communicate.